What up, HyperChange? Welcome to another episode. Today we are talking about Synchronize 2018. This is a conference. It was in Times Square, Midtown today. I just got back, as you can see, from the conference. Super stoked about it, so I wanted to fill you guys in what went down. Synchronize is called DLT, Distributed Ledger Technology for Financial Institutions. That's basically a fancy way of saying that this is a conference that looks at the ways that blockchain can be applied to traditional finance and banking and that entire industry. There's sort of a weird sort of taboo about Bitcoin and Ethereum and different cryptocurrencies there. They don't like to say blockchain or Bitcoin. Everything is referred to as digital ledger technology, but this is basically a really interesting, involvement and niche of the blockchain space, because this is the enterprise side of the blockchain that you don't see, you don't read about it in the news. It's sort of kind of really boring stuff that these solutions are trying to displace. All these back office processes where you're waiting for transactions to settle, you're waiting for trades to clear. These are all things that the blockchain could potentially disrupt significantly. And there's a whole host of startups that are leveraging blockchain technology to build solutions for this. And this is the conference where they all meet up and sort of, show their solutions and talk about their products in front of all these banks. You can tell the ecosystem is just emerging. I'm so stoked. I gotta go. Huge shout out to Synchronize and also Digital Asset, who helped me get to the event. I just learned a ton, and forgive me if I, don't say the right terms here or mess some stuff up, because I'm still super new at understanding this distributed ledger technology. But I think it is incredibly important because, Bitcoin, Ethereum, you're hearing about these in the news, but other than being really speculative assets to bet on to try and make money in the near term, they haven't gained any mainstream traction. Like, there's nothing on the Ethereum blockchain that's solving real world problems. The blockchain up until now has pretty much been just hype, other than the fact that Bitcoin is emerging as a currency. But beyond that, we haven't seen anything happen. But distributed ledger technology is, I believe, going to be the first way that blockchain actually starts to disrupt industries and change the world and live up to that promise. So whether it's called distributed ledger or blockchain or whatever, doesn't really matter. But the point is the technology is spreading, and this was the conference where these companies are pitching to banks and financial institutions for how to implement it. I took a bunch of notes at the conference. I'm gonna run you guys through the different keynotes and speakers that I thought were awesome. So let's get right into that. The first keynote was Digital Asset and R3 as a fireside chat. Now, these are the two biggest companies that are launching these distributed ledger technology solutions. They have a very key differentiating point though. Digital Asset is taking a more private blockchain approach and is building private solutions that are not open source for its banking customers. On the other hand, R3 is actually building an open source platform called Corda, and they'll be selling products on top of it. So you sort of have this private blockchain versus public open source blockchain debate. I think Digital Asset is a really, really interesting company because they have actually made the biggest progress in the entire space of anyone I track. Recently, they completed a trial with the Australian Stock Exchange and announced a partnership to implement their distributed ledger technology to replace a bunch of the back-end systems for the Australian Stock Exchange. I mean, this is a multi-year process that is going to take a long time to actually be implemented, but they're working together. The partnership is real. This was discussed in the panel, and by developing this core technology for the Australian Stock Exchange, Digital Asset's also been able to further their underlying platform, which they can use for a bunch of other stuff. So early, just scratching the surface of what these companies are working on. Digital Asset specifically is a company that I've mentioned on this channel before, and I think they're really interesting because they've raised a ton of money from some of the world's largest, most prominent banks, BNP Paribas, Goldman Sachs. I believe the Australian Stock Exchange was also an investor in the company. The CEO of Digital Asset is Blythe Masters. She was formerly from JP Morgan. Digital Asset also got a huge shout out in the crypto asset book, which I made a video about and highly recommend. I'm fascinated by this company because I think they're super under the radar, and this partnership with the Australian Stock Exchange is actually the biggest news in blockchain making progress in the real world that I think exists out there, but nobody's talking about it. And I think the fact that the hardest part for Digital Asset, I think, was to get that first customer to commit, to start to build it out. I think if they can prove that their technology works with the Australian Stock Exchange, they're gonna win so many more customers. Every bank has FOMO. I also think it was really interesting to note that although Digital Asset's platform is not open source, they just today launched this thing called DAML, which is their sort of new programming language, which does have an open standard developers kit, SDK, that anybody can download. So there is sort of a more open component to their platform as well. Anyway, moving on to the next panel, and the CEO of the Australian Stock Exchange was there too, and spent a lot of time breaking down how, they went through an incredible vetting process, as you could imagine, to actually be convinced to implement this blockchain technology. Part of the reason that it happened is because they were replacing something called the chess system. I think that's an acronym. So they were already replacing some of their back-end technology. So that's why they thought it was worth looking at least something new, since they already had to make a change. One thing led to another. And then eventually, now they've officially partnered with Digital Asset and are doing it. And they've been working with Digital Asset on this solution for 2.5 years. Australian Stock Exchange has seen Digital Asset, the company, grow from 15 people to 150 people now. The third keynote was all about smart contracts. This was fascinating. Nick Szabo, I'm probably messing that up. Anyway, he was one of the pioneers of smart contract technology. He was there on the panel. And the biggest takeaway that I had from the smart contract discussion was that there's, everyone loves to hype things up of like, oh, let's throw that on the blockchain. Let's throw this on the blockchain. And they gave the example of like, okay, you put a mango in a smart contract. I pay you, I'm gonna put the mango in the contract, and then I pay you, and then the smart contract unlocks and gives me the mango. The only problem is the mango is in the real world. It's not actually on the blockchain. I still have to give you the mango. I don't know if that's a good analogy or not, but the point being is like, if the asset itself that you want to transfer isn't on the blockchain, then smart contracts are a very difficult solution. They're just telling you to do something in the real world. That's not very useful. That's not automating, a full process. So instead of doing a mango, what if we exchange the rights to a house, let's say, which could be built into the blockchain, and my cryptocurrency, my Bitcoin, which is also built into a blockchain, that could all be programmed within a smart contract. Those are the type of things that will lend themselves to disruption from smart contracts, is where the asset can be digitized. Eventually in the future, they were discussing this idea that, you won't be rewriting smart contracts from scratch. And the bottom line is these smart contracts are code. Code has bugs. That's just what happens. To be safe with smart contracts, eventually there will be very standardized smart contracts that you can use. They even refer to them as like AAA rated, where you can say like, okay, we need to do a repo market transaction, send money to this bank, $100 million. Let's use this template repo smart contract, which is AAA rated, which has been used 10,000 times, which has already transferred $1 trillion of capital. We know it works, so we'll just use that smart contract. There'll be these templates for very popular smart contract use cases in the long term that will get rated based on their quality and performance. So I thought that was pretty interesting too. Then to end the panel, they give a really fascinating insight about blockchain overall, which was that, hey, if you want to know what's happening with blockchain and you want to be on the cusp of the future and be paying attention, don't think too much about the complexity. Think about the silly things, like CryptoKitties was an example. These are the first applications built on the Ethereum network that are sort of taking off, is something like CryptoKitties, which it seems kind of pointless. I mean, I own some CryptoKitties and it's fun, but like, it's not actually doing something. But the point is, these are showcasing the potential of the technology, what it can do, how it's evolving. It gets you excited to see things taking off and being live. This topic was called confidentiality and interoperability. I don't really know what that means, but there was one really fascinating idea that came from this panel, which is this new regulation that I believe is hitting in Europe called GDPR, which is basically calling into question of whether you own your data. Like Facebook, when they're selling all your data about what you like, they're monetizing it. I mean, I've shown this chart a bunch of times. Their average revenue per user in the US and Canada is $100 a year. Like, they're making significant money from you just selling your data, and they only have a part of it. So going into this increasingly digital future, there's this idea and potentially pitched as the holy grail of blockchain, where you get control of your data. It's sort of like self-sovereignty is, I believe, what they call it. Instead of, Uber owning my data that they have on me, Facebook owning the data that they have on me, I own all that data and can license it out how I choose and actually make money by selling people my data. I don't know. I think this is a really fascinating paradigm shift, kind of a mind-blowing idea. A couple things about the confidentiality thing they mentioned. The difficulty is with Bitcoin is that every transaction is on the blockchain, so it's traceable, which means it's not really that good for crime and criminals and terrorists, even though you might think it is. It's actually not, because it's on the blockchain, especially today with so much scrutiny. That's why you have all these other crypto assets like Zcash, Monero, Dash, which are aiming to solve this privacy solution. And one of the guys on the panel had a fascinating way to put this, which is what we're going for with these cryptocurrencies is borderless liquidity with anonymity. Bitcoin has borderless liquidity, but not anonymity. The US dollar does have anonymity in the way that if you spend cash, it's not tracked, but it's not really borderless. Last thing about this interoperability trend. There's a big theme emerging, which is that none of these blockchains talk to each other. Ethereum, Bitcoin, the private ledgers, you know, even just Corda and digital asset, what they're both working on. Like none of these ledgers or blockchains are really able to communicate well with one another. And that is a huge problem for mainstream adoption. Hyperledger, which is one of the sponsors of the event and is sort of a nonprofit, you know, tying this whole space together, has something called Hyperledger Quilt, which is sort of the goal is of combining these different platforms and making it so they can talk to each other. So I thought that was an interesting dynamic of the industry as well. Okay, the last panel of the day, and this was probably one of my favorites, which was revenue opportunities for distributed ledgers. So, you know, all the talk with this technology, at least in this world of banks and finance, has been like, okay, this is great, it's a breakthrough, we can save so many costs, save so much time, cut out all these middlemen, it's a cost minimization effort. You know, the banks are looking at this and saying we can save money, cut costs, but they're calling that the 1.0 phase of DLT. Phase 2.0 is where it actually unlocks revenue opportunity and allows these companies to grow. One of the examples they gave was tokenizing everything. So basically, imagine if you had a building, you know, a massive building in Manhattan, one of these skyscrapers, let's say where the conference was, and instead of just being able to buy that building, I'd have to pay, you know, millions of dollars. That building had 1 million tokens. It was worth $10 million. Each token is worth $10, and that would democratize sort of the access to these incredibly illiquid, very highly priced assets. And so when you start thinking about digital asset, their name as a company, and making assets digital and making them transferable, being able to split into smaller parts, which makes them more accessible, there's so much potential to what they call tokenize the world. Another example they gave was something called the Royal Mint token, which I guess is actually happening, where they're launching a token that is representative of gold, but it's actually physically redeemable for gold, just like the US dollar, which used to be backed by the gold standard. These little tokens allow you to not have to buy a full thing of gold, not carry that gold around with you, but you still can access that gold, and it's as good as it because you can actually physically exchange it for that. This last panel also touched on the fact that we are on the threshold of negotiating a new paradigm of data ownership. There's an entirely new conversation around this, you know, self-sovereignty, you know, idea. This conference got me so excited for the future of blockchain, especially with this digital ledger, distributed ledger technology, really promising for someone, for me, who's like just loves tech, to actually see the blockchain take off and start to be disruptive. Banks who move really, really slow typically are, you know, at this conference looking to adopt these solutions. The Australian Stock Exchange is already moving. I think that's gonna lead to a domino effect for digital asset. They're backed by the legacy financial institutions. They're already worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And although they do this back-end stuff that is hard to understand, these guys are really pushing the forefront of blockchain in the real world, and that is why I'm watching them. Anyway, I would love to know what you guys think in the comments below. Huge shout out to Synchronize again for letting me go to the conference. If you guys have any other conferences you want me to go to, or you have an in where I can get into and I can make a video recapping it, also hit me up with that. If you like HyperChange, definitely check out our Patreon page. We have an exclusive weekly newsletter, which I think is awesome. Make sure to check that out. Anyway, I'll see you guys next time. Peace.